I'll bring up our PowerPoint. Okay, I believe this is where we ended yesterday. If I remember right, we were talking about obedience and the question that I asked at the beginning of the class, if you remember, is would you think that you could shock a little dog up to 450 volts? And this study really started the conversations about how authority figures and obedience to authority really can influence who we do, what we do, and our actions in the situation. Okay, so I'll bring up the story. So Milgram was a psychologist. He grew up in the Bronx. He went to Harvard, and he actually did a lot of experiments beyond the Milgram studies during his lifetime. If you know anything about the idea of 6 degrees of separation, it was actually Milgram's studies that he did beyond this one that showed we know people within 6 individuals that we know, or strangers that we think are strangers, but we actually know them within 6 degrees of our social circle. But that's digressing from this study. Milgram was a Jew, Jewish, and in fact, his last name means pomegranate um, in Hebrew. But what he wanted to know is how could so many millions of people, so many millions of Germans know that there was an extermination camp in their village or right near their town, but not do anything about it? How could someone do that? So he set up an experiment where he had a teacher and a learner. The learner, even though, and they would come into the lab, the learner was always someone who was going to work for Milgram. So the learner was just not a participant, a confederate for Milgram. But Milgram had a weighted coin to where it looked like you had equal chance of being either one. But the participant is always going to be the teacher. And what Milgrams did is he would have this kind of this shock box. Whoops. This shock box. And on this shock box, there were switches. There were that started with 15 and it went into increments of 15. So 15, 30, 45, clear up to 450 volts. Okay. All in increments of 15. And this is very important. And in this, it even said XXX could cause heart or even death. So 450 volts was something seen as something that could be very dangerous. Now, any of the one that has worked with electricity, you know it's more complicated than this, but that's kind of how it was presented. Okay. And basically, what the learner and teacher did is anytime the learner, it was advertised as an experiment on learning, that we know that punishment works with animal models, that when you punish a little rat or a pigeon, they tend to not engage in the behavior that they just engaged in. But he advertised that little was known about human beings. The other thing he wanted is he didn't want just college students coming in and doing the experiment. So he advertised in the community. He just wanted regular, everyday people. So this is kind of what we have coming up to the experiment. And basically the task was a word pairing task. So if the word was originally paired orange and apple, later on in the recall part, the learner would have to say orange apple to get the answer correct, but sometimes they would miss it and say orange banana, and then you would get a shock on the shock collar. Now, other than a sample shock that was given to the teacher so the teacher could experience what the learner was going to go through, no one was actually shocked in the experiment except for that 145-volt shock that was given to the teacher so they knew how it would feel. But as it went along, as they went to 15 and then progressed, the learner started complaining about a heart condition. They'd scream. Near the end, it would just get completely silent. Okay. And Milgram's, before he did this experiment, went to all of his psychiatrists and clinical psychologist friends and asked, and colleagues, and asked, how many people do you think would go all the way up to 450 volts? And all these psychiatrists and everyone says 1 to 2%, because we know that only 1 to 2% of the population is sadistic and would engage in behavior like that. But they couldn't have been wrong. Just having a stranger in a lab coat in there with the teacher, 65%, 2/3 of individuals would go all the way to 450 volts on the shock machine. Okay. And a lot of people have asked, well, why would so many people engage in that kind of behavior? And there's some situations that we should note. Okay, is one, when the teacher would complain, the authority figure would say you must go on with the experiment, even though they were already paid for it and they signed a release that they could leave the experiment at any time. They were told that they needed to continue on, and then they asked, well, who's going to be responsible? And the authority figure says, I'll be responsible, go on, teacher. And I would also say that these individuals did have pretty high stress response to it. It's not like they just went through and flipped 450 volts and left the experiment all happy. They were all of them seemed to have some type of distress. Okay. But this is what makes this experiment work. One, you had an authority figure there. Okay. And I think a lot of this, the analogies of the Milgram study, I think about my years working with domestic violence survivors, okay? Because I would be willing to bet, maybe there's one of us, I don't know. I would be willing to bet if we went on a first date with someone and they sat there and said, well, listen, eventually, or maybe even, in our next date, I'm going to beat the crap out of you. I'm going to make it so you can't see your friends and family that I don't like. I'm going to start to control your money. And you need to always do what I say, or it's going to equal pain. Okay. I'm willing to bet, I hope, maybe I should do some prayer or something, that all of us in this class would say, no, goodbye. No, not the one. Because that's not how evil starts. Evil never starts at 450 volts. Evil always starts at 15 volts with little name calling, little isolations, little innuendos, and those kinds of things. And it escalates slowly from 15 to 450 volts. Now, I'm not saying, when I say slowly, it means that the who's going to be the survivor, but the victim at the time, doesn't always know that this is initially going to happen and end up in some type of violent situation. Because, for example, in the case of dating violence, they can go from 15 volts to 450 volts in 1 or 2 dates. I know, working with some survivors, that it was 10 years before they came to the realization that's what they were living in, because of that slow incremental abuse over time. Okay, so that's kind of a real life example, but we can think of examples all the time, like escalations in arguments with other countries on another national level. On a national level, it can start with at the workplace, um, small incremental things. A lot of sexual harassment, for example, in the workplace doesn't start usually with blatant requests. It usually starts with what's called um, um, grooming and grooming behaviors. Okay, so I just want to bring that up. Now, 65% overall, but a lot of people ask, well, what can be done? Okay, in all actuality, um, and this goes through the things that you can see, um, is that we could get anyone from 10% of people up to 90% of people to actually shock someone to 450 volts. Only 10% of people will go to 450 volts if there's another person in the room, another teacher in the room that refuses to go on. Okay. However, we can get 90% of people to go to 450 volts if there's another teacher in the room that goes to 450 volts. Going back to that informational learning stuff that we talked about yesterday. So we literally can get anyone from 10 to 90% of people to do this. And a lot of people, again, this kind of brings us, if you can touch the learner, the rate goes down. If you can see the learner, only about 40%. But if the learner can be heard, 65%. Hence, again, you know, uh, um, we can think of how many times we hear pain happening, but we don't engage in it. Okay. So, what was I going to say? And then the other question I often get is, what about women? Because a lot of the studies have been done with men. We actually found he did a series of studies with women, and he found out that women go up to 65% just as much as men do. What about the authority figure? Was it something about the Yale prestigiousness and whatnot? Well, he went and rented a little office where it was just this little company doing this experiment. There was no lab coats, there was no affiliation with university or anything else. And even in that shabby place, just having that authority figure increases the chances again at that 65% or two-thirds rate. Now, you can probably understand this Milgram studies came with a lot of ethical complications. Okay. So, if we did the full Milgram studies today, there's not a human ethics committee board that would allow it. So, how do we know? Do we have evidence that this continues today, that this level of commitment occurs? And the question is yes, because we can do what are called partial replications, okay, where we only partly replicate the entire experiment, and it's done in a much more ethical way, okay. And in a lot of these, they're actually told this is kind of what they're going to be doing, so they have informed consent going into it. Much more specific than what Milgram provided. And there was a replication done 2010, 2015, and I think 2019, if I remember right. But in each of those, it was 65% or higher. In fact, the percentage is actually going up, not down, as you would expect with a more enlightened, individualistic society that we live in today. That no, in fact, the rates are slightly higher, not statistically significantly higher, but a little bit higher than Milgram's original studies. Okay. Now, um, what about that puppy dog example? Okay. In these studies, so in a lot of the obedience studies, there's no relationship between the authority figure and the participant. So there was no relationship between the yell guy in the gray suit or the lab coat, when there was no relationship with when he did it in an office space, rented out office space. And same with a lot of the other studies that have come up with this. So what these researchers did is they decided that they wanted to kind of replicate Milgram's studies, but in a situation where there's a relationship between the authority figure and the participant. So they did this research in a senior high school class and in a couple undergraduate classes where the student and teacher gain some type of relationship, professional, of course, over the course of a semester. And then they implement this research. Okay, so what would happen if we do have a relationship with an authority figure? Well, in this case, they didn't use humans. What they did is the teacher had an assignment where the student got close to a little puppy dog and then was going to train it to do some tricks in this little maze thing. And if the puppy dog couldn't do the trick, they needed to shock the puppy dog. Again, going from 15 volts to 450 volts. Okay. And the issue though is that the experiment was done so that these puppy dogs wouldn't learn these tricks. They've been trained not to even engage in them. Okay. And so the question would be, well, one, we got to think of this non-human, but I think there's a lot of people that like dogs more than humans. Uh, but also the difference is the students had a relationship with that authority figure. And how many in this study would do this? Okay. There was actually went from 2/3 to 3/4, 75% of the students would go up to 450 volts. And the individuals who did this research was Sheridan and Keene. And they actually found a gender difference. And this is where in this class I get to prove that women are more evil than men, because the women went up 100%, went all the way up to 450 volts, but only 54% of the dudes did. So there's proof women are more evil than men. I'm kidding. Don't quote me on that. Professor Peterson isn't saying that. I need to give a little bit more explanation before making that assumption, because it wasn't that 46% of the males retaliated and said, no, this is not ethical. I'm not doing this. I'm not engaging in this behavior. It's wrong. It's hurting the dog. None of them. They all made some type of excuse, like the battery died, or the dog did the trick. Or so instead of saying that this was wrong, they made an excuse to try and get out of it. And I should also say, and this is a part of the ethical parts I have with this research as well, is it wasn't that the women just simply went and started flipping the switches. No, if in some of the recordings from Sheridan and King that you can't even find on YouTube because they're almost kind of more heartbreaking, is these young high school girls were crying, and in one, the poor girl's eyes were puffy. I don't want to do this anymore. This is no, and they were very vocal and distraught about doing this behavior. Okay, but they still engaged in it. Okay, they all engaged in it. You should say actually 100% of the males and 100% of the females all engaged in this behavior. It's just the boys got a little bit more creative of how not to have to finish the assignment. Okay. So this is another example, again, when you have a stranger versus an authentic authority figure that can influence yourself. Okay. And I'm going to end with this one today because I want to go on to. Um, so in one of my psychology classes, I had some students who just they weren't jiving with this. Someone could influence their thoughts and really influence their behavior. So I did a little experiment, as you would say, is that for this class, I did a bogus lecture on how the size and the width of your feet and your toes and the line in your toes predicts some personality factor, something about your personality. And it was a pretty good lecture. I was proud of it. I made it up on the way to class and it really sounded good, I thought. But anyways, the measure though is a week later in one of the quizzes that I gave the students for no points. This was a bonus question. Is do you think the uh, foot personality theory is valid or not valid? And it was actually on a scale, but greater than 80% felt that it was a valid measure of personality. Okay. And this is where I want to tell you guys something very important because you're all in your college classes, you're doing good, and a lot of times students give a lot of leeway in their professors and what we say. And sometimes I remember doing this in college. I would blindly kind of follow what the professor was saying and all those kinds of things. Not everything your professors tell you is true or factual. It's only based on their expertise and experience. Okay. When we get to the abnormal section, I will actually make you a bet, but we won't do it, but make you a bet that if I sent each of you to a mental health professional with the same list of symptoms, okay. And we have about 10 regular people in this class. So I send all 10 of you out with the same exact symptoms. I would be willing to bet my annual income that you'd all come back and there would be at least 8 different diagnoses. Same symptoms, but based on the mental health person's professional experience and whatnot, I'd be willing to bet that if we'd end up with like 8 different diagnoses in this class out of 10 people. How do I know that? Well, I did it with a class once, but also that's what research shows. So, Dina, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, wasn't there a study that was done about that? Like they were trying to see if this mental hospital was actually doing like their jobs, I guess. And so they sent in 10 people from a college university, which like basically what you said, like the same diagnosis. And then they all got admitted, and then when they came out, they actually did have problems. But then they did it with another 10 group of people and told them, like, hey, they ended up telling the hospital, like, all those people you admitted in the first group didn't have anything wrong with them. But in the second group, there's only a few people that had something wrong. And so only a few of them were admitted, but same thing, nothing, they didn't have anything wrong with them.
Yeah, Dina, there's been quite a few research done on that, and 2 studies, and I'll give the names when we get to the abnormal section. One of them is the Rosenthal studies, and in the Rosenthal studies, what he did and a group of his graduate assistants did is they went to an inpatient mental hospital and fugued the symptoms of schizophrenia. meaning that they faked it. Okay. And based on that, they got admitted. And then they acted completely and totally normal, like no symptoms, no nothing whatsoever. In fact, one of the participants was one of the leading experts in the field of depression. And he actually had a very intellectual conversation with one of the inpatient doctors. And based on that conversation, the inpatient psychiatrist put that individual had delusions of grandeur and feelings that he's a doctor himself. But what happened is once Rosenthal and they said, listen, this was just an experiment. Um, we're faking it. We're not schizophrenic. Um, in many of the cases, I think there was 12 of them, and I think in 8 of the cases, the university president and attorneys had to get involved in order to get them released. And in all 12 of those individuals' papers, it didn't say it was a mistake, it didn't correct anything. No, these individuals ended up with a continued diagnosis of schizophrenia in remission. So they never even admitted that they were faked. And because they wanted to think that they were so correct in their perceptions. In another research that sounds very familiar to what you're talking about, Dina, is there was some workers in a hospital that wanted to know what it was like to be a patient. And so they would go to a sister inpatient place, or sometimes it was their own inpatient place, and they would stay for a week. And as Dina mentioned, few of them did end up with mental health conditions after spending 1 week in what is supposed to be a healing place. The other ones that often got released were disgusted by the care and the indifference that was displayed, and realized that they gave that same level of disgustful indifference in their own practice. So some of them even decided, well, this might not be for me. Some of them went on to improve the conditions in their hospital. But did that kind of get to the examples you were going with, Dina?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay. All right. I want to leave the rest for tomorrow because we just have a few and it goes right into our other topic. So I'm going to stop our sharing. And I know it's a little early for today, but it's Tuesday.